Many factors affect biodiversity. We can see the effects clearly in ecological succession. Ecological succession is the process of where there's ecological change or an ecosystem, the community, is replaced by something else or another community over time. There's really two major types of succession: primary succession and secondary succession. Primary succession is the formation of a brand new ecosystem where there's no dirt to form that new ecosystem. Secondary succession is when we have scraped down to the dirt layer and recovery of an old ecosystem happens. Primary succession first. This occurs when a community forms in an area that has not been previously there. Really, this has to do with exposed rock, like a volcanic eruption that produces a new rock from lava, or if a lot of ice has melted, or if things have eroded all the way to sand, where there's no dirt layer or seed bank present for regrowth to occur. So primary succession occurs over this really long period of time. Essentially, pioneer species have to move in and colonize there first. These are specialized organisms that grow in a new environment, like moss. Have you seen moss growing on top of rocks? Or lichen? Lichen likes to grow, it looks a little different than moss, on rocky layers, and it puts in its rooting system and starts to break down that newly formed rock into materials that plants and stuff can use. So these mosses and lichens, they assist in primary succession. They basically grow in areas where all other organisms cannot. And over time, they decompose the rock material and release nutrients to form a layer of soil. This layer of soil is more complex in its nutrient system, and then plants can kind of move in and grow there. Once it has had a long enough period of time where soil can be generated, and also it can also retain its nutrients, small plants and even flowers and ferns, little shrubs, will begin to grow. From these small plants, we see a community start to take place. These plants can grow and further break down the soil, allowing for more soil and highly complex soil to be formed. And so seeds from other plants and even trees are able to grow eventually. And over a large period of time, this long period of time, plants are able to kind of come in and inhabit that area. As new species move in, then new animals also become available and will move into that area. Organisms in which each stage may hinder their own survival, but of course it'll pave the way for future organisms to move in. Eventually, we're going to get to a community that has very mature trees and is very stable. It's going to have very little change that'll happen to it after that. So once we reach this place, we call it a climax community. It's a very stable, very mature community of plants and animals that will reside in that place for a very long time. This is kind of like the end of the primary succession process. Now, secondary succession occurs when there's been previously occupied organisms there, and there was once a community there that has now been destroyed by some type of disturbance. Sometimes it's even just like a weather factor, like a hurricane, but it can also be farming, where we have scraped the forested area to plant crops, and also, a fire. A fire can come in and take down a lot of vegetation and shoo away a lot of the animals that lived there. Secondary succession has an established community that has been destroyed, but the seed bank, the soils, they're still there. So it's going to take a lot less time than it does primary succession for something to come back. So a pioneer species for secondary succession, it's going to look a little different. It's going to look more like weeds and grasses. So this process typically begins, with the weeds and the grasses because those things are able to grow very quickly and their reproductive seeds are still there in the actual dirt and soil. And so this will proceed again until a climax community is reached. As humans, what we want for our healthy ecosystems is for them to be stable. A stable ecosystem is one that remains relatively constant, and if it does change, it's at least predictable changes. So, if you think about it, where in succession you would expect to find organisms in stages that last for shorter periods of time or longer periods of time. Well, shorter periods of time at the beginning, but eventually longer periods of time at the end. And why might secondary succession tend to occur more quickly than primary? And that's because we don't have to, make the soil from scratch. It's like starting with a cake mix and just adding eggs and milk and oil to put in the oven. And if you start from scratch, you have to gather all your materials separately: flour, sugar, other flavor components. So we already have something there. And how is that going to be different for organisms? Like, what kind of organisms would you expect to find in an area where the disturbances have been like very, very frequent, like a lot of forest fires, or they've been intense, intense and devastating? So you would want to see pioneer species like lichens and mosses move in where you have seen these disturbances happen often, frequently, and of course to some extreme nature like a volcanic eruption.